Cool. So zakatable net worth is something that's very specific and exact, and it contribute a lot of assets contribute towards it, but not all of your assets are part of your zakatable net worth. And the way to calculate is it for those of us who familiar with some level of accounting, it's basic, just assets minus liabilities, and not all liabilities are zakat deductible either. I'm not going to go too much into depth about liabilities unless we have some time left over at the end. Like I mentioned, I'm already kind of short on time. So I'm just going to kind of sift through the assets bit because I think an understanding of that should, set us up really well. And for most of us, unless we're business people, most of these liabilities don't apply. So sort of moving forward to the next term here now, we've got the Nisab threshold, right? And the Nisab threshold is basically kind of set up by the Holy Prophet, peace be upon him, and it's set up against two different thresholds essentially. And I'll kind of explain, why there's two and why we need to use one of these. So the first one is basically set up against gold. So this is for someone who only owns gold, right? And this is a scenario which rarely occurs in our day and age, right? There can be no one who can say that the only earnings, or sorry, the only possessions that I have is just gold. I don't have any cash. I don't have anything else of value. The only thing I own is gold. So for a person like that who owns only gold, the threshold is set at 87.45 grams or $7.5. This would roughly come out to be, I think, somewhere close to 1.5 million rupees based on the current market rate. Then the second nisab is based on silver, right? This is more relevant to everyone. So this is $52.5 or 612.15 grams of silver. And this is, depending on the going rate for silver, I think I checked yesterday, it was around 133,000 rupees. So anyone whose, zakatable net worth is equal to this threshold of silver or is above this threshold of silver qualifies for someone who can be referred to as Sahib-e-Nisab, right, on a specific date. And for most of us, the third bullet point that's given on the screen is what applies, right? Having a mixture of gold and silver and probably some other sort of assets as well, such as cash and property and so forth. So basically, anyone who has a portfolio of assets that is equal to this Nisab threshold of silver is someone that we refer to as the Sahib-e-Nisab. And just to kind of go through this, I think I'm just going to do a quick example. So let's assume a person has 1 tola of gold, right? And 50,000 rupees in cash. That's all they own. Now, the market price of gold, this is from, I think, 2 days ago, 223,000 rupees per tola. And then you have the 50,000 in cash. So that totals up to 283,000. Now, this 283,000 rupees is above the current nisab of silver, which is 133,000 rupees. So they become someone who we call as a Sahib-e-Nisab. And therefore, zakat will be applicable on that. Now, the next thing that we mentioned here, right, was they need to have a zakatable net worth that is more than the nisab threshold on their zakat date. Now, this is a concept that I think a lot of people confuse. I think this is something that I myself was confused about. Even my parents, didn't really have a very good understanding when I first spoke to them about, when should I pay my zakat? Am I eligible to pay zakat? So this is something that's widely misunderstood based on, the interactions I've had with people in our community. So the thing that you have to understand is that, your zakat cycle first begins on the day that you end up hitting the threshold, right? So let's take an example of someone who's just started working, right? They're in their first job. Let's say they're earning 100K a month, right? And they're spending maybe 40K a month. Now, after a few months, based on whatever is being saved up in their accounts, they will reach a stage where their net worth, just purely based in cash, will cross that nisab threshold, right? They'll have more than 133,000 rupees left over in their bank account. That is essentially that date, according to the lunar calendar, is when they become the Sahib-e-Nisab for the first time. And you have to kind of use the lunar calendar for these calculations, because if you look across the lunar and the solar calendars, so for anyone who's not aware, the lunar calendar is the Islamic calendar, based on which we calculate the month of Ramadan, which is going to start either tomorrow or the day after. And the solar calendar is mostly, what we use in general colloquial terms like January, February, March, and so forth. So the lunar calendar is 10 days shorter than the solar calendar, right? So if you kind of track your date according to the solar calendar, what ends up happening is that about probably 36 years across time, you will end up losing 1 year. And that's a problem, right? Because that's 1 year's worth of zakat that you basically haven't accounted for across your lifetime. So it's probably best to use the lunar calendar to do this, and it's actually highly recommended. And essentially on that date, so over here you can see this is the nisab threshold. This person is crossing that. They become a sahib nisab here. And then they're kind of gonna wait for an entire lunar year up until the next time this date crosses again. So maybe this was first of Ramadan. On the next year, on the first of Ramadan, they will calculate their sort of payable amount of zakat. During this period, they don't need to kind of, so if you go forward, they don't need to look across, what's happening to their net worth from a Sharia perspective. It doesn't matter if it fluctuates down or fluctuates up. They're basically a sahib nisab as long as, they're basically staying above going to zero. So that's actually the next slide. Yeah. So basically, as long as they're above the nisab throughout the year, that's fine. They've maintained their sahib nisab status. But in case their net worth goes all the way down to zero or actually negative, so let's say they have to take on a huge personal loan for something, right? That's when their zakatable net worth will basically go below zero. And that means that they've lost their sahib nisab status. And once they lose their sahib nisab status, then they have to kind of, restart that cycle all over again. Like we mentioned initially, right, for someone who's just started a job, they'll basically be considered someone who actually can be given zakah. And this is something we'll, go into detail towards the end. But once you're below zero, that means you're not a sahib nisab anymore. And then you kind of wait until you get back to the nisab, whatever it is for that year, right? 133,000 again. Once you hit that, then you start your cycle all over again. So that's basically the explanation of the three terms that we discussed in the first slide. I'm going to kind of move forward now towards understanding, what are zakatable assets and sort of how to understand them and go forth. So this is just a slide. I'm not going to spend too much time going over it because this will be shared in the group after the call. These are just basic steps to understand, how do you determine your zakat date and, what do you do when you know what it is and how do you figure out if you're eligible for that year or not. And one thing that a lot of people might have concerns about is that they don't really remember when they first became a Sahib Nisab. Now I spoke to some scholars and they mentioned that it's preferred to probably figure that out, using your bank statements and account statements. But if it's really difficult and you can't do it, it's fine to pick one date across the lunar calendar and then kind of stick to it. As this is, the starting date for me. And one tip one of the scholars mentioned for a lot of folks, the Sahib Nisab stated might come after their marriage, right? Marriage is an event usually in our cultures where a lot of gold and jewelry and such and cash is gifted to the couple. And for a lot of people, that is kind of when they receive a significant amount of wealth into their possession. So even just using your marriage date or your nikah date as the date when you definitely know that I was given this much wealth can work out for you. All right, so now moving forward to zakatable assets. Essentially, zakatable assets are divided into four categories. So that's, gold and silver. Then you've got cash or, other forms of currency, which we'll go into, right? And then goods for trade. Anything other than this, so, this could be jewelry that could be made out of other precious metals. This could be, stuff like precious gems and stones like diamonds and the like. Your cars that you use, even if they're cars that you don't use, right? Like let's say someone's got like 6 cars in their house. It doesn't matter. Cars, not
वालेकुम अस्सलाम कैसी है मैं आती हूँ तो क्या
all right. Furniture or appliances, so sort of things that you use around your house, and then personal belongings as well, right? It doesn't matter if you've got like a Gucci bag lying around or if you've got a really expensive phone or a laptop. These things are not zakatable unless you bought them with the intention of reselling them, right? Or trading them for profit. And we kind of go into detail about that a little bit later, right? So these four categories. And the first one we want to probably go into is gold and silver, which is the most common form, I think, that counts the most. So what you have to understand is that it doesn't matter how you've acquired this gold and silver jewelry, and it can be in any sort of form. So it could be a gift from someone, it could be something that you bought, and it could be literally, made out sets that are used, or it could be actual bullions or any form of gold or silver. Those fall into zakatable assets. Another thing that is very important to understand is that in any form of jewelry, the actual measure of gold and silver is only the zakatable part. So let's say, you buy like a diamond ring, which is set in gold. Now, the value of the diamond is not going to qualify towards the zakatable asset. It's just the value of the actual gold that the diamond has been set in, right? As we mentioned previously, diamonds and other precious stones do not fall under the category of zakatable assets. So the weight of the gold and the silver should be calculated based on the current market price. And then that's what you would, kind of, sorry about that. That's what you would basically use to calculate your zakat, right? And if you've got something that is less than 100% purity or 24 karat gold as it normally goes, you would use the rate sort of for that purity, right? So if you've got something that's set in 18 karat gold, you would use the rate for 18 karat gold against that weight to calculate it. And anything that's below 50% purity in terms of gold and silver does not qualify for zakat. So that's normally 12 karat gold, or, in general terms, the sort of jewelry that we call artificial jewelry that you can buy, at local stores and such. You don't really have to account for those as long as they're below 12 karat. And then this is something the last point is something me and my wife actually just did a couple of weeks ago, is we went into the jeweler, and we kind of got him to, weigh up everything that we have in terms of gold, and he kind of gave us a breakdown of what sort of weight each thing has and what value it has. So that gives us a very good and accurate idea of how much zakat is due on each of these. So that's gold and silver. The next asset class is basically cash and currency, and I've kind of put stocks together with this just because it's sort of very similar. So for cash and currency, any currency that is widely recognized can be traded for goods and services. Is part of your zakatable assets. So this can include any form that can be converted into cash. So prepaid gift cards, checks, pay orders, anything of that sort. Again, this is irrespective of how the currency was acquired. So you could have earned it, you could have probably gotten it as a gift. I hope no one here has any currency that they've stolen. That would be a problem. But even if you have, zakat would still be applicable on that. Stealing is generally a sin, and it's not preferred to do that. But once you have that cash in your possession, you would have to pay zakat on that. And then for foreign currencies, if anyone has any, you should get it valued at the current going exchange rate in the market. You can use the Google rate as well. That's fine. No issues there. And then same goes for cryptocurrency. If anyone has any sort of investments in crypto, those would fall under this category as well. And you would have to kind of figure out, okay, what's the value for Bitcoin right now? How much does that equate to in rupees? And then calculate your zakat based off of that. For stocks, you basically have to understand that if there can be two intentions for stocks, right? You could have bought stocks on mutual funds for the intention of resale, right? You want to keep it and you want to kind of resell it later for a profit margin. Then you have to kind of figure out the market value of the shares that you have. And whatever the market value is, you would take the zakat percentage of that. For stocks, you have so the second intention here could be that you've just invested in a mutual fund or a stock or an ETF, and you're holding that as an investment, and you're basically using it to generate dividends. So in both of these cases, you will be getting dividends, obviously. The dividends will fall into your cash category because that's a payout that you're receiving. But for the second scenario where you're sort of just using it as an investment and you plan on holding it for yourself and just use those that additional income for whatever reason you want to do that, the zakatable asset category should be calculated based on the current assets of the company you've invested in. So there is an example. If someone is interested in this, you can raise this in the question answer. I'm not going to go too deep into it because this doesn't apply generally to a lot of people. And I've only got 15 minutes left. So I'm just going to skip through this. If we need, we can come back to this to kind of understand how do we calculate that. All right. The next thing is goods for trade. This is something that generally applies to people who are in business, but it can also apply to someone, who it is not in business, but maybe does trading on the side. So you have to understand that anything that you bought with the intention to kind of trade it or sell it forward will fall into your zakatable assets. Now, this could be something as simple as a mobile phone that I brought, right? Let's say I buy a new iPhone 15 with the intention of selling it 3 months down the line because I know the rate is going to go up in the Pakistani market or something along those lines, right? That will be a zakatable asset for me because my intention there is to make monetary profit from it, right? Now, intention here is very important for goods for trade. Let's say the phone that I bought was for sale, but then, once I get the new iPhone 15, I'm like, oh, you know what? I've got a really old phone, man. This would be a really nice phone for me. Let me just start using it myself. Now, my intention here is changing very quickly, right? And it doesn't matter how quickly it changes, it's changing now. So then that phone does not fall under goods for trade because I no longer intend to make any profit from it. I'm just using it for myself. And similarly, anywhere anywhere in between these intentions, let's say you're really confused about the new iPhone 15, right? You've bought it, you really wanted to sell it to make some money, but now you're like, oh man, I really want to keep it, and you're kind of going through these motions and can't figure out what to do with it. As long as your intention is not clear about what you have to do, you do not have to count it towards your zakatable asset. Now, that does not mean that you deliberately just assume that you have a mixed intention, right? I think intention is something that most of us know very clearly when we're taking an action. So you can't, like, because the idea here is not that you're going to be fooling anyone else. This is something that you're solely doing for your own self and for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So obviously he knows what your intention is in your heart. So you can't pretend like, oh, you know what, I'm gonna keep it, but then I'm also looking for an opportunity. As soon as someone comes along, I'm just gonna sell it. If your intention is to sell it, whether you're using it or not, you have to count it towards your zakatable asset. For business folks, anything that you're using in your business sort of as a fixed asset, or even as something that you just require. So let's say there's machinery in a factory, there's obviously furniture in an office building, vehicles that you use. They do not count towards accountable assets because those are necessities for your business to run. Anything that is a current asset as defined by the accounting standards, right? So maybe you have some petty cash lying around in your business, maybe you have some raw materials that you use to develop whatever products, or even if you have developed products. So let's say someone sells clothes, right? And they've got 100 shirts lying around that they're intending on selling. Those will count in zakatable assets because, again, the idea here is that the intention that you have there is to sell them for profit, right? And lastly, if someone is in a partnership when it comes to business, each partner will pay zakat based on the percentage of share that they have in the business, right? So like based on the total, let's say, that you've got petty cash, that's the only thing that the business has. Let's say it's 100,000 rupees and, there's two partners in 70-30 partnership. So the person who owns 70% of the business will pay zakat on 70% of the value of the money, and likewise 30% for the other guy who does not, who only owns 30% of that business. The next thing within this goods for trade is real estate. Now, this is something that can be widely applied to a lot of people, regardless of whether they're in business or not. And what you have to understand is that there can probably be only two intentions when you're buying real estate as well. So one can be that I'm buying some land because I want to keep it for whatever reason, right? I could be keeping it because let's say I want to go for my master's and I'm investing in property because that's a good way to, save my money up and save it from inflation. And, 5 years from now, I'm going to sell that and go for my master's, maybe take a trip to Germany or something. Maybe I have kids and I'm keeping that property for their university fees, for their marriage, whatever is it. The key here is that I am intent on keeping that money, keeping that land for myself and using it for sort of a personal need down the line. Now, if this is the case, then zakat is not applicable on this property, right? And then the second intention is that I am buying that investment solely with the intention of making money off it, right? Like I'm buying like a very small plot somewhere very obsolete that I know 10 years from now, this area is going to become very developed. I'm going to sell off this property and I'm going to make some nice, bank off of this sale. Then that falls into zakatable assets, right? And I have to pay zakat every year on that property, right? And once again, mixed intentions or unclear intention means that this is not zakatable, right? So maybe I'm confused about a property, whether I'm going to keep it or whether I'm going to sell it. Maybe I want to build a house on this in the future. Maybe my children will build a house on this in the future, right? I mean, this also applies to inheritance-based sort of investments that one might make for their children, right? So your intention is that, I'm buying this property somewhere, whenever I die or whenever I move on from this world, my children will inherit it, and this will be a source of benefit for them. In that case, you're intent on keeping that property as long as you're alive. So this is not something that would fall under a zakatable asset category. Yes, if you do intend on investing and taking your money out and reinvesting it somewhere and kind of building a portfolio for your kids, then it's probably best to consider it in zakatable assets, because again, you're selling that asset for profit. And then the last thing, if you bought something with the intention of leasing it out, so let's say you buy a building and you want to lease it out to people to build shops in it. The building itself is not a zakatable asset, although the rent you received from that building, again, that's the profit that you're receiving, is something that would fall into the zakatable asset category. So that's everything that we've done so far. There is one thing that I skipped out, which was agricultural stock, which I don't think applies to most people here. But if someone has specific questions, again, feel free to ask those at the end or shoot me a message. I'd be more than happy to kind of go into the depths of those and maybe get answers if I don't have all of them, right? Now, that's the last thing. Sorry, I'm just going to take a sip of water. The last thing to kind of go over, is who is eligible to receive zakat and then how to kind of pay it out. So for this, again, we refer back to the Quran. Right, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, إِنَّمَا الصَّدَقَاتُ لِلْفُقَرَاءِ وَالْمَسَاكِينَ وَالْعَالَمِينَ عَلَيْهَا وَالْمُؤَلَّفَةِ قُلُوبُهُمْ وَفِي الرِّقَابِ وَالْغَارِمِينَ وَفِي سَبِيلِ اللَّهِ وَابْنِ السَّبِيلِ فَرِيضَةً مِّنَ اللَّهِ وَاللَّهُ عَلِيمٌ حَكِيمٌ. So Allah gives the criteria for people who are eligible to receive zakah in the Quran itself, right? And those are the ones that are highlighted down here, right? Fuqara are the poor, masakin are the needy, alamina alayha, for those employed for it. So these are people who, by the state are appointed to collect zakah and do this process. So this is something that, doesn't really apply in our ages anymore. This is something that, if you look back at the time of the Prophet, peace be upon him, there was an entire committee set up by him of people who would go out and kind of, take zakat from people of various different tribes from different areas and kind of bring it back to Medina, where the central sort of Baitul Mal would then distribute it among the people who were needy, right? And I think I'm just going to move forward to kind of explaining each of these in a little bit of detail. So Masakin, people who don't possess any assets at all, someone who's that poor that they don't possess any assets at all. Fuqara are people who have assets, but they're below the nisab, right? So the original nisab threshold that we spoke about is 133,000 currently in Pakistan. So anyone who has assets that are below that would qualify for this. And you can kind of take the understanding from here that, anyone who's not a sahibe nisab automatically becomes eligible to receive zakat. So, this could be one way that you could easily kind of cater towards them. Muallafatul Qulub is people who, are struggling financially. And because of that struggle, their iman has become very weak and they're thinking about leaving Islam. This is something that's very common in our day and age as well, given the financial conditions of our country. There are people who, I won't name anyone here, but obviously there are people who changed their religion, Nauzubillah, to, leave Pakistan, to seek refugee status in other countries, to seek asylum in other countries. So if you know someone in your circle, in your families who's thinking about going through that, trying to do something, definitely consider them as people who you can give your zakat to in order to help them, in order to kind of, keep them within the fold of Islam, inshallah. Fi riqab, people who are slaves, this is not applicable in our times because Sharia-based slavery has sort of been abolished. It's finished. We don't have any sort of valid reports of what we would count as slaves in the Sharia law existing right now. If the practice of slavery is happening somewhere, it's completely illegal as per the Sharia law as well nowadays. Gharimin are debtors. So, this is something that we spoke about earlier on. Someone who's taken debt for their personal use because they were going through some financial struggles. And, now their debt exceeds their assets, right? So someone who's gone below that threshold and below zero threshold of net worth as well. There's someone who can be paid zakat. The sixth one is Amilin, government appointed zakat collectors. Again, this does not apply in the modern age. And please be aware that, any sort of employees of private zakat organizations do not qualify for this, right? Because this is not something that is set within the Sharia. So we cannot, just take someone outside of that definition and put them in here. They're privately employed. They get paid all around the year. Their structure is completely different, so they don't fall into that. Fi sabilillah is in the path of Allah. So this kind of qualifies for two sort of categories. One is people who are at jihad, who are, eligible for zakat. And then secondly, anyone who is fully, focused on studying Islam. So this is scholars or potential scholars who are on their way, people who are studying in madrasas. They don't really go into the corporate world. They don't have any means of income. So they're generally, their lives are sustained on zakats and sadqas. And then the eighth category is Ibn Sabil. So this is a very interesting one, mashallah. And this is needy travelers, right? So this could be someone in this day and age who, maybe is on a trip to Dubai, right? And let's say on the way there, they completely lose all of their possessions, right? Or they're robbed or something. And now they're stuck in Dubai without a phone, without a wallet, without any sort of access to their own wealth or to get help from someone. In that case, within that particular scenario, now this person could be someone who's, a millionaire back in Pakistan, right? It doesn't matter. Within that particular context and situation, there's someone who zakat can be given to help them out in that particular situation. But what you have to be careful about situations like these is that there's someone who cannot access their wealth back home. And you can kind of understand this in a historical context as well, that in the past, when people used to travel, they did not have bank accounts or credit cards or debit cards or any way of kind of taking their wealth with them. So when they would be on their travels, they had whatever they were carrying. And if they, got robbed, or they, lost some of their wealth, there was no way for them. A lot of historical scholars in Islam have actually written about this, that when they would travel around to kind of study at various different institutions and go to meet scholars from other regions, they would oftentimes have to pick up odd jobs on the way there. Like maybe they stay in a town for like a couple of weeks, and they would work there, earn some money, use that money to kind of fund the next part of their travel, and then kind of have to stop wherever they're running out of cash. This is not the case anymore in most modern travel cases. So again, this is something that's a very specific scenario. Lastly, people who are not eligible for zakat. So this would be non-Muslims, right? You can give general sadaqah to non-Muslims, but they do not fall under the category of zakat. Then to the Banu Hashim. So this is the family and the descendants of the Prophet, peace be upon him, through his various descendants. Zakat does not apply to them. They're not eligible for zakat. And we've seen examples in the hadith where the Prophet, peace be upon him, himself did not used to eat from anything that was given for charity, right? He would not take anything from that. You cannot give zakat to your own ascendants or descendants. So essentially, the idea here is that zakat is meant to be something that purifies your wealth, right? You're removing something that you believe that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will give me barakah in return for this. Now, generally, for most of us, we're responsible for our own grandparents, our parents, our children, and their children, and so forth. That's a farz upon us as Muslims, right? Now, using zakat as a substitute for that farz is something that is not allowed, because otherwise people would just basically give zakat amongst their families and keep the wealth within that, right? So that's not allowed. You can take care of them outside of zakat, but you're not allowed to give them zakat. You cannot give zakat in return for something that someone owes you. So maybe someone lent you money, and now you're paying them back, and you're like, oh, you know what, I'm just going to take this out from my zakat because this person is someone who's not sahib in Islam, is eligible to pay zakat. You can't do that. You have to pay that money back separately, and then you can give them zakat if there's someone who's eligible, right? Then zakat cannot be given to larger institutions. So you can't just give zakat to a madrasa or to a masjid or to a hospital for something that they're doing, which falls within the ambit of the institution. This one is a bit tricky because you do have certain madrasas and masjids and hospitals which have a zakah fund set up. It's probably always best to check with them how they're utilizing that zakat money. In most cases, what they do is they will have a zakat fund, and then when they get a patient, who requires donation and is eligible for zakat, they will use money from those funds. But generally, I think it's probably best to always investigate and do your best in terms of making sure that my zakat is being used in the right place. Because as we'll go over the last slide, you'll sort of understand that zakat isn't really finished until it reaches the person who's eligible. Siblings are eligible or not. Yeah. So you can give to siblings, right? Because taking care of your brother or your sister is not something that's farz upon you as per the Sharia. It's highly recommended. And you have to understand that with your siblings, the family line kind of spreads out, right? So you have your own family, your siblings got their own family. Your income level, your wealth status, your lifestyle can be significantly different than your siblings. So you are allowed to give them zakah. And it's actually, I think, generally in the hadith of the Prophet, peace be upon him as well, it is preferred to help out, your kin, close to kin and your neighbors first before kind of looking beyond that to find more people that you can help out with your zakat. So definitely siblings is like the best way to use your zakat. And then lastly, zakat is not a tax upon you, like I mentioned initially. And you can't say that, oh, I gave the Pakistani government this much tax this year, so why do I have to pay zakat? You have to understand that these are two completely separate, concepts. The state tax is something that is owed to you as an individual to the state for being a resident in that state, for earning an income, for participating in the economy. And zakat is something that again, is between you and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for the risk that He's giving you essentially, right? So with that out of the way, how do we pay zakat, right? And over here, I think you will probably see, Aisha, at some point I've written down the comment about the kin. But anyways, So first things first, you should pay out zakat as soon as it's due. So as soon as your zakat date falls on the lunar calendar, you should just tally up all of your assets and calculate 2.5% of that, how much ever that comes out to be, and you basically pay that out. You can pay zakat in advance. Let's say you say I'm gonna give out 1,000 rupees every month, as intent of giving zakat. But then by the time you reach your zakat date towards the end of the next year, you calculate whatever zakat is due on you for that year, and then you subtract whatever you've paid out. And if you have any extra balance, like let's say you've paid more than what you were supposed to, you can carry that forward into your next year's zakat. And similarly, if you've paid less than what your final zakatable net worth was, on your zakat date of that year, you can pay the extra amount on that day, or in the following days, and kind of balance that out as well. You can pay it out in installments. So one thing you have to understand is that your entire sort of cycle of zakat is a lifetime cycle. So across your lifetime, you have to make sure that you've paid out whatever zakat was due on you. And you can kind of make the intention of separating out the money and then paying it out in installments over time. That's something that's permissible. You can give cash, you can give food, you can give clothes, you can give anything of need to the person that is eligible for zakat. In Ramadan, a lot of people give out food rations because those are mostly probably the things that needed the most. And then for anything that you've missed in the previous years, you can kind of estimate how much was owed to you or how much was due on you in terms of zakat, and pay it out in the following years, right? And then make sure that your intention to make zakat is made before you pay out the money. It's not, you can't just be like, oh, I gave 5,000 rupees yesterday and now I'm going to decide that that was out of my zakat. That's not fine, right? You have to make the intention of making it a zakat payment prior to actually making the payment. And then, yeah, so over here we can cover, it's most preferable to give zakat to one's eligible relatives or neighbors. So relatives here, is anyone in your extended family. So obviously your siblings, and then, your parents' siblings, your grandparents' siblings, their children, your cousins, your nephews, your nieces, all of them would qualify for this. It's just your direct line, right? So right above you is your parents, above them are their parents, and then right below you is your children, and then below them are your grandchildren. And also, you cannot give zakat amongst spouses. I don't know if I mentioned this or if it was on one of the slides. A wife cannot give zakat to a husband, and a husband can't give zakat to a wife, because they're essentially considered to be the same entity, right? It's almost the same problem as like shuffling wealth amongst one another. And for husbands especially, it's generally farz upon you to take care of your wife's needs. So you can't replace that farz by saying, oh, my wife's really poor, because I don't take care of her in the first place, and I'm going to use my zakat to kind of help her out. That's absolutely not appropriate, right? You can give zakat to your employees and servants, but then you have to make sure that that's completely separate from whatever other contractual agreements you have with them. And then one very important thing that I think is kind of very tricky in our culture is you don't need to tell someone that you're giving them zakat when you're giving it to them. You can say, this is a gift from me. You can say, this is just some money I put aside, I feel like you need it more than I do. Or however, like, be very respectful, make sure that that person doesn't feel embarrassed in terms of receiving zakat. And even when you're trying to kind of, understand whether someone is zakat eligible or not, try not to hurt their feelings, right? Like, so try to go about it with a lot of hikmat and with a lot of understanding that, finances, when someone is going through a tough period, it's hard for them to talk about it in the first place. So you should make sure that you're kind of going about it in a very civil manner. So you can generally have a conversation about them, like, oh man, how's it going? How much are you earning at your job nowadays? Or do you have anyone else in the house that earns, etc., etc.? So try to make it as comfortable as possible, and don't push the limits to the point where you're like, oh, I absolutely need to make sure that this person is eligible, right? If you have some general idea that this person is eligible, it's fine, inshallah. Like, even if it turns out afterwards that you paid, once you've done your investigation, in terms of understanding it, and then, maybe 2 months later you find out, oh, this guy has, got like 50 tolas of gold sitting in his vault. That's okay. Your zakat was done based on the information that you had available. Inshallah, Allah will accept it. You did your best to figure it out, right? And maybe that person lied to you, right? They said, oh, I only make 20,000 rupees a month, but in reality they're making way more money than that, and they've got a lot of savings. It's fine. The onus is not on you to absolutely investigate their financial status. It's to just get a general idea of whether there's someone who's eligible or not, right? And then, you can pay zakat for someone else, or someone else can pay zakat for you. This is generally something that happens between couples. I don't think anyone in this day and age would be going around being like, hey, can I pay your zakat? I don't think that really happens. So amongst couples, it is possible, but generally, it's also better to pay your own zakat. And husbands can pay out wives' zakats, but generally, wives cannot give zakat on basis of instead of their husbands, because again, the responsibility of the finances of the household fall upon the husband from a Sharia perspective. And then lastly, how do you kind of pay it out? So you have to understand that, whatever you're giving in zakat, whoever you're giving to, that person becomes the unconditional owner of that amount or of that property, whatever it is that you're giving them, right? And you have to make sure that, you hand over the possession to them. They're in charge of it. They can do whatever they want with it. You can't really question them afterwards, like, oh, I gave you zakat. And you really can't make it into like, oh, I gave you zakat, so now do some favor for me or now be nice to me. That's generally an expectation that can come up in your head, but just remind yourself that you did it for the sake of Allah. You didn't do it so that the other person would like you or they would become, closer to you or do you some sort of a favor, right? If you do intend on going through some sort of an agent or an organization, you have to make sure that they've actually delivered that zakat to the people who are eligible, right? Just giving it over to them does not fulfill your obligation. You have to really make sure that they've paid it out. So try to get proof from them, try to ensure that, the money that you gave them is being used in the right place. And one thing that I'd like to just point out that a lot of charity organizations that are currently working, maybe don't take proper care in understanding who is zakat eligible and, how do we kind of set up a system. So probably best to always ask and, do your own investigation before kind of choosing who you're going to go through. And lastly, it's mostly preferable in this day and age to give your zakat out personally, because that way you can kind of make sure you're, understanding all the things that are happening in it, and it's actually, inshallah, very beneficial as well, right? Like doing charity from one's own hand is definitely something that has a lot of spiritual, I think, and sort of emotional benefits for yourself as well, rather than kind of just, giving it away to someone else to do it on your behalf. So yeah, that's basically it for the presentation. I think we've got about 12 minutes left over. I'm sorry I went a bit over, guys, but I'm happy to take any questions in the chat, or if anyone wants to stop as well, feel free. Can you elaborate more on stocks? Sure, yeah. Uh, I'm just gonna take Shiroz's question first. So he's asking if I can elaborate more on stocks. So, Shiroz, for stocks, what you have to understand, like I mentioned earlier, right? There can be two sort of investments in stocks. One is for the intention of, one can be for resale or trading. In that case, just the market value of the stock, you can take 2.5% of that market value, and that's the zakatable amount that you have to pay out. Right. The other part of this is that you have, let's say, shares in a company. Now, I'm just going to try to explain this to an example. I can also share slides from the group later with these examples. So let's say you have 1,000 shares, right? And you look at the company's financial statements and you see that it's composed of 40% fixed assets and 60% current assets, right? So you have to understand that the part is applicable only on current assets. So what you will do now, and for example, let's say the value of your share is 200 rupees. So 1,000 shares at 200 rupees in a company that has 60% current assets, right? So you basically multiply those three figures, right? You'll get 200 into 1,000 into 60%. And I think that should be 120,000 rupees. Now that is the amount of which 2.5% you'll calculate. Again, this can be very complicated to kind of understand from hearing it. So what I'll do is I'll share an example. I'll write this out and share with you. And then if you have any further questions, you can reach out. Um, Aisha is asking zakat deductions made by bank is okay or not. Again, Aisha, I think it's probably best to check with the bank, right? Each bank has its own mechanisms. Whether it's Islamic banking or not, you should probably ask them like, how are you using this zakat? Gonna do with it, etc., etc. And because again, you have to understand, like when you're doing it through an agent or an organization, the obligation upon you is to make sure that they're getting that money to the eligible recipients. So as long as you can do that and you're satisfied with it, inshallah, there should be no issue with that. Khalil Bhai is asking, is it a good idea to make the recipients aware that they're receiving zakat? Yeah, so Khalil Bhai, we covered this. it's not important. It's not necessary for you to make them aware, because obviously it can come with a lot of shame and embarrassment for the person who's receiving the zakat. So it's completely fine for you to tell them that, hey, this is a gift from me, or this is just some money that I'm giving you, or some other form of, whatever it is that you're giving it with. It's completely fine. There's no need for them to know. You just have to know that this is out of my zakat. Janara, I think you had raised your hand. Do you want to ask your question? Does distributing meals count as a cart, or does it have to be in form of ration? Uh, that's, I don't really know. I think it should be okay, but let me check on this and get back to you. I think it should be okay, but maybe in that case, you're making it. Actually, I'll have to ask this one. Sorry, I'm not sure about this. If distributing meals counts, I think it should, based on what I understand, but I'll still ask and get back to you. Is there any particular time period for paying zakat? No, so zakat becomes due on you on your zakat date every year. You can choose to pay it out on that date, or you can choose to pay it out in installments. Generally, people pay out zakat in Ramadan, because in Ramadan, what happens is that any good deed that you're doing, the reward for it gets multiplied by almost 60. Sorry, 70. So it's beneficial more in that regard for you to pay your zakat out in Ramadan. But what you have to understand is you have to just account for it across your entire lifetime. So whatever zakat was due over you across your life, you have to just make sure that you pay for that.
Show me. Oh, show me, what are these? Are these boxes?
Adbi, are you asking me a question?
So sorry, so sorry, so sorry. No, 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 no.
Okay. Any other questions? Okay. I think that's it for questions. So I will probably end this. And for those of you who maybe have not joined the WhatsApp group, I'm just gonna share the link in this chat as well. I'll share a recording of this session in the WhatsApp group, and then on the Slack thread as well. For anyone who's interested, they can watch it later on. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out. I'm happy to ask scholars and kind of help you get those answers. Thank you so much, everyone. I hope you guys have a nice rest of your day. Allah Hafiz.